In Exodus chapter 20, we read about the event that was undoubtedly the most significant, the most transformational in all of human history. God's revelation to humanity, not merely to a single individual, but to an entire nation. A nation that is then charged with conveying the message of God, the message of that revelation to the world. We're not discussing Exodus chapter 20 today. God willing, we look forward to many future opportunities to explore that profound, fascinating, and extraordinary narrative. Our concern today is with Exodus chapter 19, the chapter that immediately precedes the story of that revelation. And rather than focusing upon the content of the revelation itself, appreciating that, as with human events and experiences, for which there necessarily precedes a period of intense preparation, this experience is surely no exception. And I think there are critically important messages for us to be able to discern from that period of preparation that is so vividly described in Exodus chapter 19. So it is on that note that we embark upon our discussion of the chapter. The chapter begins, benignly enough, in Exodus chapter 19, verse 1. In the 3rd month after the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. And in verse 2, when they were departed from Rephidim and were come to the wilderness of Sinai, they encamped in the wilderness. And here we get to the first crucial anomaly in the text that illuminates the process of preparation. It's subtle. In fact, is not really preserved in translation. The English reads, and there Israel encamped before the mount. Now we note the words encamped that appear in both of these clauses in verse 2. It is instructive for us to consider the original Hebrew. In the first of these instances, the Hebrew reads, vayachanu, they encamped. Very simply, the plural that we typically, repeatedly find in the description of Israel's journeys through the wilderness. What's significant and anomalous is the second verb, also translated as encamped, is the same root, but a different conjugation. This is in the singular, as if Israel ceases to function as the conglomerate of individuals that it normatively is. And indeed, Israel is generally described as a collective plural. Here, it's a singular. The nation has become as one in readying itself for God's revelation. Now, beyond the anomaly and its implications with respect to the unity of the nation, we really see that expressed not merely in the verb, but also in what follows. Because in verse 3, we see very clearly whom God is addressing, that God called to Moses out of the mountain, saying, thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, house singular, and tell the children of Israel. But the principal focus, again, the unity, the house. And the message manifestly is to the nation as a nation, not merely as a set of individuals. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Verse 5, which admittedly we've discussed in other contexts as well. Now therefore, if you will hearken unto my voice, indeed, and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own treasure from among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. A couple of important observations with respect to this verse that are especially relevant for our discussion today. First, as we have had occasion to note in the past, the Hebrew that is translated here as treasure is perhaps more rigorously rendered as designated royal property. Israel belongs to God. This status confers upon Israel not privileges, not prerogatives, but rather a mission. As God's designated property, they have a mission. For all the earth is mine, to project God's message to the entire world. That, after all, is part and parcel of my covenant. That emphasis upon the covenant, which is, of course, articulated right at the outset, before we get to the actual revelation, as the goal of the revelation, is critical. It is, of course, in that vein that we read in verse 6, and you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And as we've discussed, that again confers not any sort of privilege or prerogative upon Israel, but rather a mission. Just as the priests principally functioned as the teachers, the educators, the spiritual guides, so the charge is of Israel to be a holy nation in order to communicate that holiness to the world. These are the words that you will speak unto the children of Israel. The nation, as a nation, is to enter into this covenant with God. Now, it's important for us to appreciate that the revelation about which we would read presently in Exodus chapter 20 is certainly not the total content of that covenant, of that emergent relationship with God. Rather, on the contrary. In Exodus chapter 24, we read, and God said unto Moses, come up to me into the mount and be there, and I will give you the tablets of stone and the Torah. Here translated as law, but we prefer rendering Torah either as Torah or, a better translation, the instruction, the teaching, the totality. And a commandment that I have written that you may teach them. This is certainly not merely the content of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. And indeed, while we can read the full content of that revelation, the Decalogue, in a matter of just a few minutes, we read in Exodus chapter 24, verse 18, and Moses entered into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mount, and Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. Now, I must admit, we still have a great deal of difficulty understanding how, in just 40 days and 40 nights, Moses could have mastered the totality of the Torah, the totality of God's teachings to humanity. That's inevitably for a different discussion. It's sufficient for our purposes at present to recognize that 40 days and 40 nights is orders of magnitude greater than the content of the revelation to the nation at Sinai. In other words, what takes place at Sinai in Exodus chapter 20 is not the total content, but rather the starting point. The point of initiation of a relationship that is to play itself out over the course of history. Indeed, as a result, what's critical in our understanding of the relationship is that it includes a covenant, an agreement, into which two parties enter together, God and Israel, and it encompasses a mission that is expressed in terms of being a treasure from among all peoples, that designated royal property. For all the earth is God's, and all the earth ultimately needs to be recipient of that message, and again, to be the kingdom of priests, the holy nation, the communicators of that message, the teachers of the world. In appreciating that this is the designated mission of what takes place at Sinai, we can, of course, far better understand wherein lies its historical significance. And I think it is instructive, in this vein, for us to consider what Moses teaches us further. In retrospect, 40 years later, in Deuteronomy, in reflecting upon this extraordinary event that had taken place near the very beginning of his historic career. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, Moses begins, much as was stressed in Exodus chapter 24, by referring not just to the Decalogue, but rather, and now, O Israel, hearken unto the statutes and unto the ordinances. The full corpus of the rules of living that the Torah, that repository of teaching and instruction, conveys to us. The goal of which is that you may live and come in and possess the land that God, the God of your fathers, gives you, which of course again is the fulfillment of the mission of Israel ultimately to the world. Now, in this vein, we speak of course of the mission generally and the way of living that promotes the fulfillment of that mission. We should note also the land that is the stage for the mission's fulfillment, this land, the land of Israel. But furthermore, in verse 9, Moses stresses in particular, only take heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes saw, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. And in verse 10, it's explicit. What is the principal event that your eyes saw the day that you stood before God, your Lord, in Chorev? Chorev, of course, being one of the other names of Mount Sinai. Moses refers to this extraordinary experience. When God said to me, assemble the people, and I will make them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live upon the earth, and that they may teach their children. This is entering into the covenant at Sinai. And you came near and stood under the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire unto the heart of heaven with darkness, cloud, and thick darkness. And God spoke unto you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the voice of words, a sound of words. You saw no form. And he declared unto you Again, his covenant. The emphasis is upon the covenant, entering into that relationship, in the context of which, of course, again, in verse 14, as a very vivid recapitulation of what we saw at the beginning of the chapter, there is reference to the statutes and ordinances and doing them in the land, whither you go to possess it. The content of the Torah, all of the rules, the statutes and the ordinances, they were not the principal focus of God's revelation to us at Sinai. That, again, came later. When God summons Moses to ascend the mountain and gives him the full corpus of his teaching, of his instruction. That comes later. What's critical is the experience itself of entering into that covenant with God. And indeed, in the continuation of chapter 4, we see the extent to which this singular experience connecting with God has such profound impact. Because, inevitably, appreciating that at both the beginning of chapter 4 and at verse 14, we read about the role of the land. The role of the land being as a critical ingredient to the fulfillment of the mission that was established at Sinai. We appreciate likewise the dire consequences of Israel failing to fulfill that mission in the land. That mission for the sake of which God brought them to the land. The consequence of that failure can be forfeiture of the land, exile. And indeed, of course, as we well know, this was Israel's fate by dint of its dereliction in fulfilling the mission. But there's a promise in the continuation of chapter 4. After having been banished from God's land, there is the assurance in verse 30. In your distress, when all these things are come upon you, in the end of days, you will return to God your Lord and hearken to his voice. For God your Lord is a merciful God. He will not fail you, nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your fathers, which he swore to them. Well, that was the covenant with the fathers. But there is more than that, what took place when God established a covenant with you. In verse 32, for ask now of the days past which were before you, since the day that God created man upon the earth, and from the one end of heaven unto the other, whether there had been any such thing as this great thing is, or has been heard like it. What great thing? Next verse. Did ever a people hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard, and live? The revelation at Sinai. The revelation at Sinai, by consequence of which unto you it was shown that you might know that God is the God. There is none else beside him. And again, in verse 36, stressing the vivid intensity of this extraordinary experience of divine revelation. Out of heaven, he made you to hear his voice, that he might instruct you. And upon earth, he made you to see his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. And now, know this day, and consider it in your heart, that God is the God in heaven above and upon the earth beneath. There is none else. the revelation at Sinai cemented this realization. And of course, again, in consequence of that, we read about keeping all of God's statutes and all of his commandments, but that's all the additional elaboration, the extension, if you will, the fleshing out in rules of living. The revelation at Sinai came first. The revelation at Sinai is the starting point. Of course, by dint of recalling all this, you are assured of prolonging your days upon the land that God your Lord gives you forever. The restoration. Because after all, once you get the message, then you reaffirm your commitment to the mission. And it was, after all, in order to fulfill that mission for the world that God gave you the land in the first place. But now, returning to chapter 19 and its implications, and just what is so critical in this preparation. Again, I feel compelled to stress that key dimension of the covenant that God makes with Israel here, above and beyond the covenant that had already been affirmed with respect to the patriarchs. And in that vein, I think we can well appreciate the give and take, as it were, that we read in both Exodus chapter 19 and in chapter 24. In chapter 19, after Moses calls together all the elders in verse 7 and tells them what God is commanding, there is a response in verse 8. And all the people answered together and said, all that God has spoken, we will do. In much the same vein, in Exodus chapter 24, when Moses comes and tells the people all the words of God and all the ordinances, all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that God has spoken, we will do. And what follows, in fact, is a vivid and detailed description of the ritual of establishment of a covenant, culminating in verse 7, that Moses took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that God has spoken we will do and obey. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that God has made with you in agreement with all these words. You know, when we consider this exchange, dialogue, Moses tells them what God is commanding, and the people explicitly accept the commands. On the one hand, you might well argue this acceptance on the part of the people is totally superfluous. After all, it's God's command. Just who do you think you are to express your willingness to accept these commands? Like, who asked you? After all, following the events of the Exodus, to affirm that we have a debt of gratitude, a debt of allegiance to God as our Savior, fairly self-evident, isn't it? The obligation then to submit to God's command should be equally self-evident. So why the emphasis here on Moses presenting the proposal, as it were, and the people affirmatively responding, accepting the divine command? At this point, I suspect the answer should be self-evident. It's all about a covenant. It's all about establishing an agreement. A covenant, by definition, is between two parties. It's not enough to merely state that we are obligated to accept because God is in charge. Submission in this vein is inadequate because submission by itself is not establishing a covenantal relationship. A covenantal relationship is first and foremost a relationship, not submission. It's an agreement. It's an agreement that requires two parties to enter, as it were, into a partnership with one another. That makes all the difference. And indeed, having already noted what we see in Deuteronomy chapter 4, when Moses invokes the recollection of the revelation at Sinai, it is instructive to consider likewise what we read explicitly in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And Moses called unto all Israel, again it's all Israel, and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances that I speak in your ears this day, that you may learn them and observe to do them. So of course, we notice, once again, as we saw it expressed in Deuteronomy chapter 4, the statutes and the ordinances, the whole content of the corpus of Torah, the rules for living. But once again, the emphasis as the basis of all of that is not simply the total content of the corpus, but rather the covenant. And here it's explicit. God our Lord made a covenant with us in Crave, where again I remind you, Crave is just one of the names of Sinai. It's referring to the revelation at Sinai. And God made this covenant not with our fathers, but with us. Even us who are all of us here alive this day. This isn't the covenant with individuals. And this is not the covenant that God made with the patriarchs. This is something more than that. It is something that is established with the nation as a nation that is then charged with God's mission to be the kingdom of priests, the holy nation, with a message for the world. And likewise in verse 4, God spoke with you face to face in the mount out of the midst of the fire. Now, of course, face to face must necessarily be understood anthropomorphically, figuratively. There isn't a face, as it were, certainly in physical terms, in any literal sense, that could be described here. But I submit to you that describing this confrontation as face to face is further affirming just what we said about a covenant. There need to be two parties here. And the parties are presented, as it were, in verse 4, as on par with one another, face to face. It is an agreement. It is a partnership. It is a mission that defines our role in the world. Now, in preparing for this entry into a covenant, again, the content of the revelation about which we read. In chapter 19 of Exodus, to which we once again return here, we see that there are specific steps that we need to take in order to prepare for this experience. And I think it is instructive for us to consider what they convey to us, both in terms of what the covenant was for, and much more immediately for us, how it impacts upon our lives today, and our relationship with ourselves and with God on an ongoing basis. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 9, and God said to Moses, Lo, I come unto you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever. This is going to be a completely transformational experience, and will never be the same again. And in verse 10, when God, as it were, responds to Moses telling the words of the people to God, expressing their readiness to enter into the covenant, God says to Moses, go unto the people, and of course, again, I stress, it is the people, not the individuals, the nation as a nation, and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and be ready for the third day. For the third day, God will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. Note here, in addition to what we had highlighted at the outset, back in chapter 19, verse 2, about the nation coming together as a nation, not merely as individuals, because only as that greater whole is the nation capable of entering into the covenantal relationship with God. Here, we read first that the prerequisite of entering into this covenant is doing something proactive. You need to sanctify yourselves. To sanctify yourselves, to ready yourselves for the revelation. I would take that act of sanctification in a general sense as signifying that in order to, as it were, come face to face with God, you need first and foremost to want to get there, to rise to the challenge. That act of sanctification means to take the initiative in doing something to come closer to God. That's the first step. And there's an additional corresponding step in verse 12. And you shall set bounds unto the people round about, saying, take heed to yourselves that you go not up into the mount or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mount shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through. This isn't referring to any court-imposed sentence, but rather having committed, if you will, a mortal sin. Because while that act of sanctification is step one, there is necessarily the step two, which in a sense signifies just the opposite dynamic. On the one hand, that act of sanctification is expressing love, attraction, striving to come close to God. But inevitably, that needs to be balanced with the reverence of restraint. There need to be borders. Again, set bounds unto the people. So in preparing for that revelation, in preparing to enter into this covenant with God, there are two dimensions that need to be expressed in the conduct of the people. The act of sanctification, to strive to come close, and the establishment of bounds, to recognize that we're not there. It's important for us, of course, to appreciate that this duality applies not only to Israel on the eve of God's revelation. This duality applies, after all, to each and every one of us all the time. On the one hand, if we don't feel that striving, that yearning, that persistent longing to sanctify ourselves, to come close, then tragically, we will forever remain out in the cold, spiritually. So there is, on the one hand, that striving, sanctify yourselves. Draw as close as you can. But simultaneously, you better remember you're not there. And to the extent that we don't have the wherewithal to actually reach God, we need to express that longing, that striving, that yearning in this world with the establishment of bounds, and are operating within those bounds and expressing our love and our reverence for God through them. Only thus can we enter into a covenant with God. So these two rules, these two prerequisites of sanctification on the one hand, and the setting up of bounds on the other, are of course the necessary beginning, the necessary requirements for being able to enter into the covenant. But there's an additional dimension, and it's critical for us to note this. This is something that, regrettably, again, is difficult to express in the English translation. So we're going to have to note the subtleties of the Hebrew here. What God tells Moses to tell the people in verse 11 is, what's rendered here as, be ready against the third day, for the third day God will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. Third, in Hebrew, is shlishi, which is the term that appears in both of these instances here in the text. But now, consider what Moses says to the people. Moses went down from the mount to the people, we read in Exodus chapter 19, verse 14, and he sanctified the people, and they washed their garments. That is, he gives them the instructions that had indeed been conveyed by God. But in verse 15, and he said to the people, be ready. Well, the translation here reads, against the third day, but perhaps more rigorously we should render this as for 3 days. Note, the Hebrew is not shlishi, third, but rather lishloshet yamim, for the 3 days. You may be wondering why I'm quibbling over subtleties of language here. The implication, however, as we understand the verse, is that God said, ready yourselves over the course of 2 days for the third day. Moses said, we need an extra day. So ready yourselves over the course of 3 days. And it is then only after that 3-day period of revelation, of preparation, that the revelation actually takes place. Why am I emphasizing this point? Remember, a covenant is an agreement reached between two parties. A covenant is a partnership. God summons of us to take initiative. What Moses did in concluding that there was a need for an extra day was not an act of irreverent insubordination. It was rather a keen appreciation of just what God expects of him, expects of us, expects generally of humanity. God, after all, could just as easily do it all himself. He doesn't, because he's taking us in, as it were, as his junior partners in making the world a sanctified place, a more godly place. A covenant is not something that he does to us, because the covenant altogether isn't something that one party does to another. A covenant is something we do together. And Moses' initiative then, likewise, is a crucial ingredient in our appreciating what a covenant really means. In the continuation of chapter 19, reading about the vivid experience of God being manifest upon Mount Sinai, we read likewise in verse 17, and Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet God. Now note, this is once we've already read in the previous verse, there was thunder and lightning, a thick cloud upon the mountain. It is critical, again, here too, in appreciating that a covenant is a partnership. That it's not a matter of God exclusively coming to man. Certainly isn't a matter of man exclusively coming to an indifferent or passive deity. It is rather a joint venture. Moses brought forth the people to meet God. The two parties, as it were, are meeting together. We have an ancient tradition that regards the revelation at Sinai as the equivalent, as it were, of a wedding canopy, the establishment of a reciprocal relationship. Again, that is necessarily what a covenant is. And there's an additional subtlety that I feel compelled to stress in verse 18. Ostensibly, simply describing the vividness of the experience. Now, Mount Sinai was altogether on smoke because God descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. You note the verb here, descended, in the Hebrew yarad. In much the same vein, likewise, in verse 11, on the third day, God will come down, descend, the same word in the Hebrew, yered. Now, in any literal sense, I'm sure I need not point out to you that speaking about God descending or ascending is patently meaningless. Descending, ascending, terms that pertain to altitude can only apply to physical things. Well, we agree that God isn't physical. So what can possibly be meant by speaking of descending or ascending? And indeed, moreover, we should note that as God stresses in Exodus chapter 20, verse 18, after the revelation, God said unto Moses, "Thus shall you say unto the children of Israel, you yourselves have seen that I talked with you from heaven." And of course, parenthetically, we should note, as we have already had occasion to note in the past, that when God speaks of heaven, he certainly does not mean outer space. You know, apropos of the first Russian cosmonaut, upon reaching outer space, announcing that he had been to heaven and hadn't found God. How pathetic. Heaven, in this sense, obviously is a spiritual realm that transcends the bounds of time and space. So, of course, again, in that vein, we reiterate the question, what's meant by God descended? Of course, inevitably, we appreciate the answer. It's not physical descent. Of course, it has nothing to do with altitude. What it signifies is God, as it were, is coming down to our level. That's not intended to be in any way put down, but rather the realization that while we might have otherwise thought of God exalted out there, up above, as it were, and we puny mortals are bereft of any possibility of establishing an intimacy with God. Not so. God descends to our level. If I may share with you the subtlety of an ancient tradition, the first written commentary on the Torah, on the teachings, 5 books of Moses, is the original Aramaic translation of the original Hebrew that was undertaken by Onkelos, a Roman-born proselyte who incorporated the ancient Jewish traditions regarding the words of the Torah into his Aramaic translation. And Onkelos consistently, in translating all texts in the Torah that speak of God descending, refrains from literally translating that into Aramaic as God descended. Rather, Vayered Hashem, the Hebrew that literally means God descended, Onkelos consistently translates into Aramaic as V'itgilei Hashem. God revealed himself. Now this isn't simply some replacement of one word for another. This is the translator functioning as the explicator. Because whenever we read in the text that God descends, what it really means is God revealed himself. And when we appreciate what that revelation means the reciprocity of his covenant. God comes down to our level, as it were, in order to reveal himself to us in terms that we are capable of understanding. Because the covenant, again we reiterate, is a partnership. When we consider the message emergent from the establishment of this covenant, the establishment of this partnership, I think we can well appreciate the message to us after the recapitulation of the Decalogue of this revelation in Deuteronomy chapter 5, when Moses tells us, "These words God spoke unto all your assembly, in the mount, out of the midst of the fire, of the cloud, and of the thick darkness, with a great voice." Now, the Hebrew here is ambiguous and can accommodate two diametrically opposed translations. V'lo yasaf is translated here as, "and it went on no more." Ironically, another possible translation is, "a great voice which did not cease." It went on no more on the one hand, because of course the revelation at Sinai was a singular event. It doesn't happen every day, even every generation. It happened once in human history. A critical transformational event that changed us and changed the world forever. But simultaneously, that great voice did not cease. Precisely because of the singularity of the event, we and the world are transformed forever. And so indeed, when we consider the very last words of the prophets, of the last of the prophets heretofore, the prophet Malachi, what does he have to tell us? At the end of his prophecy, at the end of the period of prophecy, remember the Torah of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Crave at Sinai for all Israel. Statutes and ordinances. Statutes and ordinances again. The complete corpus. All the rules of living. But fundamentally, it's remembering what happened at Sinai. Remembering the Torah. Remembering the establishment of that covenant. It is, after all, on that basis that the prophet tells us, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of God. Meaning, it is through the Torah, through that transformation, that you are ready. And you ready the world for the great and awesome day of God. Whereupon he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers. The entire world will be restored to its divine source. Ultimately, that great and awesome day of God is God's domain. But God charges us with readying the world for it. God charges us with a mission through this covenant. He makes us his junior partners. He enables us to rise to the challenge. It is in preparing for that challenge that we read his message in Exodus chapter 19. The content of the covenant is, again, relegated to Exodus chapter 20 and not for now. But that preparation is essentially in our hands. It is our charge. It's our responsibility. That is the greatest gift that God has given us. In some ways, maybe even greater than what follows. Because this is empowering us to become his junior partners, to make ourselves and to make the world more godly, to ready ourselves and ready the world for God. God bless you.